company's fault. It's the organization's fault. It's the leader's fault. What are you as a company doing about that? But how come we don't have more conversations around what are you doing about this as a human being, right? You're lonely? Great. What are you doing to solve that problem? Why is it the company's responsibility to fix your loneliness? Why is it the company's responsibility to give you purpose and meaning? Why is it the company's responsibility to make sure that you're engaged, make sure that you're learning and growing and developing? Why is it the company's responsibility to make sure that you have a friend? Putting all of that, this is what I mean when I say companies are becoming parents. It's not realistic. And so we need to give more accountability and responsibility to employees. You're lonely? What are you doing when you get home after work? What are you doing on the weekends? You don't have purpose and meaning? What are your personal values that you care about? Are you even at the right company? Like, why did you take this job?
Jacob, welcome to the show. How are you, my friend?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Good. How long has it been? Like a year since we last spoke?
I think it's been a little bit more.
Really? Oh, right.
I think so.
Fine.
It's been a long time.
How you been? Every time I speak to you, there's another book coming out. You got a million projects. I'm like, how do you do it? How do you continuously disrupt Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of fun with that stuff. So there is a new book that I'm working on for next year on employee experience.
Oh.
I don't think I've actually shared this with anybody yet, so your group might be the first ones that are hearing it. It'll be around this time next year.
Amazing.
So still a ways away.
Amazing.
Haven't even started writing it, just doing interviews.
Oh, wow. And that's what I love about your work is that you take the time to do the interviews and you can't skip that process, and there's no quick way to do that. And I don't think people really understand how much work goes into that part, right?
It's a lot. I mean, as you know, you interview a lot of people as well. But yeah, I mean, it takes time to set up the interviews, have the conversations, know what to ask. And then if you have a bunch of conversations, you got to look for the trends, the responses, the stories, follow up with all of them. So it's a lot of work, but I learn a lot from it. And then I think it also gives a lot of credibility. You know, one of the challenges that I have with a lot of books, whether it's leadership or employee experience books, is oftentimes they're based around like one or two companies or one or two stories. And somebody will write a book and say, Apple is great. Here's why Apple is amazing. Or here's why Microsoft is amazing. And most people who read that are like, I'm not Apple and I'm not Microsoft. I'd love to hear what somebody in construction is doing or somebody in finance. So I like different perspectives, different companies, different industries, different geographies. It kind of makes it a little bit more real.
Yeah. You 100% need that diversity of thought. And as you mentioned, the cultural nuance that also comes along with it. One of the things I was really happy to see, and I'm glad we're also going to talk about it today, is the book that you released, Leading with Vulnerability. And it's really interesting because I mentioned just before we jumped on the call, I just got back from our CHRO roundtable in New York. That was high on the agenda.
Really?
Yes, which was a surprise for me, a pleasant surprise for CHROs. And in fact, we ended up doing a session led by Keith Farazi. I'm not sure if you know Keith's work, where we spent time going around the table. And this is the day one where everyone's just met each other and sharing some of the things that we're having challenges with and sort of starting the conversation, setting the foundation of the 2-day event by leading with vulnerability. And it created a completely different dynamic. And that really helped the next few days. And I just thought it was really cool. And I was really, when I saw that you first, mentioned that you're releasing the book, I was like, I'm really excited.
It sounds like all those attendees need a copy of Leading with Vulnerability.
Yeah. I'll send you the list. We can get some over to them. Why did you write that book? Why? Give me because you've always got a good reason behind going on these journeys. Yeah. What was it around that topic that you were like, hey, I need to really spend some time on this?
Well, the concept of vulnerability is not new. Brené Brown obviously pioneered a lot of the concepts and research into this, 15 years ago now. But as I was working on a previous book called The Future Leader, I was interviewing 140 CEOs for that book. And the concept of vulnerability was coming up a lot from those interviews. But CEOs were conflicted with a few different things. Number one, they all understood the power of vulnerability in their personal life. So with a friend, a family member, a spouse, a significant other, why you would want to be vulnerable with them. And it's because it creates connection, relationships, and builds trust. But a lot of these leaders were also telling me that at work, there's a different dynamic. Because in your personal life, it's one thing, but at work, you have leaders, you have employees, you have projects, deadlines, you're being paid a salary, you have a team, there's a hierarchy. is vulnerability at work the same as it is at home? And the second piece of this is vulnerability for leaders the same as it is for everybody else?
Mm.
In other words, if you're a top executive at your company and you're being vulnerable, is that the same as opposed to you just started working at the company for a few weeks or months and you're being vulnerable? And so I kind of stored that information away. I didn't do anything with it. And then a couple of years went by and it was time to start brainstorming a new book. And I kind of went back to that and I thought it would be really interesting to explore vulnerability, but specifically from a leadership and from a work perspective. Because that is something that I haven't seen done before. So I interviewed 100 CEOs for the new book. We did a survey of 14,000 employees with leadership from DDI and came up with a lot of, I think, very interesting and unique perspectives on vulnerability at work. And the biggest insight from everything, counterintuitive to everything that we're talking about now, is don't be vulnerable at work.
Really?
And yes, and it's, I'll explain. Yeah, it's a very, very, very different. So what I mean by that is when most people think of the concept of vulnerability, they think about exposing a gap that they have, a gap in experience, in intelligence, in wisdom, in capability, in whatever it is. And so you're basically saying, hey, there's this gap that I have and I'm sharing it with you and you can use that against me, right? I mean, it's something that you put out there or you acknowledge something. And when you do that, other people have the potential to use that against you if they want to. So for a lot of us, that's what most of us think of vulnerability at work, is you share or do something that exposes a gap that you have. Leading with vulnerability, on the other hand, is about exposing a gap that you have and then demonstrating what you're trying to do to close the gap. This is the right approach inside of the workplace. So a very classic example that I always use is, let's say you work for a leader and they give you a really important project to do and you mess up the project. Now, being vulnerable means that you go to your leader at the time and say, hey, I know how important this project was. I am so sorry I messed this up. That's a very vulnerable thing to say. You got to look your leader in the eye and you got to say that. And it's good to have the psychological safety inside your organization to be able to do that. But if you go to your leader and say that, there's not a leader in the world who's going to look at you and say, gee, thank you for telling me that. A lot of the leaders are going to look at you and they're going to say, well, what are you going to do about it? The customer is still unhappy. The deadline has still not been met. The goals have still not been achieved. Like, what are you going to do? Like, thank you that you brought the problem to me, but now what? So the concept of leading with vulnerability is about exposing the gap that you have and demonstrating what you're trying to do to close it. So in that same situation, if I make a mistake and I screw something up, the right way to approach it would be, hey, I know how important this project was. I'm so sorry I made a mistake. Here's what I learned from the mistake. Here are 3 things that I'm going to do going forward to make sure that that mistake doesn't happen again. Here are some options that I have for how I can try to remedy this problem going forward. That's different. That is what is needed in the workplace because, again, it's a different dynamic. You have a salary. You're being paid to do a job that you were hired to do. So it's not that vulnerability on its own is bad, but we need to add the leadership piece, the competence piece to that vulnerability. And when we asked 14,000 employees, we said, what's the number one reason why you are not vulnerable at work? And the number one response was, I don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent in front of my team. Well, if you don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent, then add the competence to the vulnerability. Don't just talk about the weakness or the incompetence or the mistake. Add what you're doing to close the gap. And that's the big distinction and the big difference. And why I tell everybody, don't just be vulnerable at work, but instead lead with vulnerability.
It's so interesting you said that. You gave me a flashback to a moment when I was maybe like 22, 23, and I walked into my CEO's office to have a conversation. I can't remember exactly what I did wrong or what it was, but I remember Maria telling me, next time, come with a solution.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? I'm trying to tell you that I need help and I'm being vulnerable, etc. And she was like, great, but don't. It was a bit more harsh than that. It was, don't ever come back in my office without a solution. But to your point, it was a good point, you know, like, and I never did ever again. So I was like, whenever I brought something like that to the table, I came back with, and actually this is what I'm doing about it, to your point.
Yeah.
As well.
And it's a huge, huge distinction, and it will dramatically change how people perceive you. It'll dramatically change the teams that you're able to create. And I think it'll also help you become more successful inside your organization because if you think about it, so there's a concept in psychology called the pratfall effect. And I interviewed the creator of this. His name is Elliot Aronson. He used to teach at the University of California, Santa Cruz, which is where I went to school. And when I spoke with him, he told me that so the concept of the pratfall effect is basically, let's say you're really good at your job, you're very capable, and now you make a mistake and you admit to that mistake. What happens is a lot of people look at you and they say, oh, wow, so and so made a mistake, but they're really good at their job. Now you get a little bit of a 1 + 1 = 3 effect because people already knew you're really good at your job. They knew you're really talented. And now that you're adding the vulnerability, you're adding the human component there. And so now people think that you're even more likable, more capable, more talented, more relatable. But the flip side of that is also true. If you are not good at your job and you're not demonstrating that you're trying to close those gaps, you're not demonstrating that you're trying to get better, and you keep just showing up talking about your vulnerabilities, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Yeah, I need help here. Oh, I wasn't feeling well. Sorry, I'm late. If you just keep doing that all the time, what happens is it reinforces your mediocrity. In other words, a lot of people are going to look at you and they're going to say, yeah, I kind of get why you're not getting promoted. I get why you've been
Or I
stuck in
can't
that
rely on
job.
you. I can't rely on you. Yeah.
Yeah. So it creates that negative perception of you. So all of this is to show that there's no substitute for competence, for being good at your job. And I think what a lot of people are doing, whether inadvertently or purposefully, is we sometimes use vulnerability as a way to justify poor performance. And that is not the right approach inside of an organization. So make mistakes, talk about vulnerability, but add the leadership, the competence piece to those types of discussions.
Yeah. Could you share the Hollis Harris example?
Ah, yes. Yeah. It's whenever I give a talk for a company, it's the story that I always open with. So the Hollis Harris story, he used to be the former CEO of Continental Airlines. And in the late 80s and the early 90s, the airline was going through a lot of trouble, as we know. Continental Airlines absorbed by United Airlines now. But the company was going through a really hard time, and the board came to their CEO, Hollis Harris, and they said, hey, you got to like send out a memo to the workforce. Tell people what's going on. Communicate with them. Do something because things aren't going well and everybody's wondering what the hell's going on at the company. So he sends out this memo to his entire workforce. I think it was around 40,000 employees. And he talks about the challenges in the business, the micro and macroeconomic factors, why the company's struggling, this and that. And then he ends his memo by telling his employees that the best thing they could do is to pray for the future of the company. Very vulnerable thing.
Yeah.
He was fired the next day because there was no leadership. So, and it makes a difference, right? Because let's say Hollis Harris was Joe in accounting. And Joe in accounting shows up to work and says, oh my God, the company is going down. I don't know what's happening. Like, pray for the future of the company. Somebody's probably going to go up to Joe in accounting and say, whoa, 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 whoa. Why don't we go out for lunch, take a day, relax, everything's going to be fine. If you're an executive at the company or a CEO and you show up to work and you say, oh my God, the company's going down, what's going to happen, blah, 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 people will panic.
Yeah.
So vulnerability for a leader is not the same as for non-leaders. And this was reflected to me by Doug Parker. He's the former chairman and CEO of American Airlines. And he told me that there were lots of times where he couldn't be vulnerable, like especially during the pandemic. Everybody was talking about how the airline was going to go bankrupt and he had to go in front of Congress and ask for money. And he told me that there would be many times where he would sit alone in his car before he would go into the office and he would try to pump himself up, say positive things, listen to positive music, like build himself up before he would walk into the office because he needed to show that competence, the confidence. He couldn't show any kind of vulnerability because people were looking to him and relying on him. And he, it was a very, very difficult time for the company. So when you're a leader, it's not the same as it is for when you're not a leader.
Yeah, I love that. It's interesting because even the words, right? We're seeing words that CEOs have just said that have just like affected their share price by literal billions because they were in an interview and just said the wrong thing, and all of a sudden, now Elon's a good character. for saying and doing certain things. He's a very he's
Yes.
a brilliant mind, but sometimes you shouldn't let him be in front
He's
of a microphone.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he's certainly an anomaly. And look, there's always exceptions to every rule. There's always
sure.
somebody like an Elon out there who, defies any kind of logic or leadership criteria.
Yeah. So we just spoke about essentially vulnerability versus competence, but can you elaborate on why vulnerability alone can make leaders seem incompetent?
Sure. I mean, it kind of goes back to what we alluded to, right? If you were to imagine sort of a grid on an X and Y axis, and you have four boxes. And so on the X axis, imagine that you have vulnerability, and on the Y axis, you have leadership. So at the box closest to the focal point, you're kind of a novice. You're a beginner. You haven't really charted your leadership trajectory yet. So you're deciding which path do I take? More vulnerability, more leadership, or kind of somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
So if you only go down the path, and again, the x-axis is vulnerability. So let's say you only really excel on vulnerability. Right,
Is this the vulnerable leader equation you're describing right now, or is this different?
No. It's a different one. So the
Okay.
vulnerable leader equation is probably the most important part of the book, and it's what I hope everybody remembers. And it's leadership plus vulnerability equals leading with vulnerability. You got to have both. Leadership plus vulnerability.
Okay. Sorry.
This box that I'm talking about kind of takes that and plots leadership and vulnerability on an X and Y axis.
Okay.
So same concept, but imagine it on an X and Y axis. And it kind of shows the relationship between the two. So if you only focus on vulnerability, what's going to happen is people will look at you and they'll say, well, we have a great working relationship, great connection, great relationship. I like to hang out with this person. I feel like I can talk to them. We can collaborate. It's just, we have a really, really solid connection, which is important. But if I were to ask that same person, well, what do you think about that person's leadership abilities, their competence? They're going to say, well, I have a great connection with them, but they probably shouldn't be in a leadership role because they're just not demonstrating their competence. Now, similarly, let's say you only focus on competence and not on the vulnerability piece at all. And I would go to one of the employees who works for you, and I'll say, what do you think of so-and-so? They'll say, oh man, this person, they're so good at their job. They're bringing in a lot of deals. They're making a lot of money. They're solving customer problems, but I don't really feel engaged or inspired by them. It's kind of hard to work with them. We don't really collaborate well. I don't feel that sense of connection with this leader. So they're really good at their job, but they're kind of a robot in the workplace. And it's hard to work with them. And so this is why you need both. You want to be able to connect with the people that you work with and for, and you also want to know that the people you're working with and for are good at their job. Mm. And so if you only have vulnerability, people will view you as being incompetent. And if you only have leadership, people will view you as being a robot. And so if you're in between, you have leadership and vulnerability. Now you're demonstrating you're good at your job and you have the ability to connect with people. And those are fundamentally the two most important aspects of leadership. Are you good at what you do? Do you have the ability to connect with people that you work with and for, or customers for that matter?
Mm-hmm. No, love it. Where does well-being come into this equation? Because a lot about vulnerability in the conversations that I had, and one of the things that everyone listening to the show I've shared over the last couple of years is my own personal challenges with mental health, with anxiety, just burnout, etc. And for a long time, I hid that from my team, my co-founder, even my wife. And I shared that a couple of years ago and kind of opened that up to the conversation, which I was terrified of. Am I going to be seen as weak? Am I going to be seen as a CEO that they don't want to work for? Am I going to be seen as what's my daughter going to think of me? And I do think that's improved all of my relationships and build more trust with my team. But at the same time, where I'm just trying to think, that's not competence, or where does that fit into your equation?
Yeah, well-being is so I have a little bit of a counter take on well-being. And by the way, I also had a similar issue. So we talked about why I wrote the book on the business side. On the personal side, I grew up not believing in vulnerability. I thought it was dumb. I thought it was stupid. I was raised by parents who came from the former USSR, so immigrant parents. My mom tried to teach me emotional vulnerability and openness. My dad was the exact opposite. Don't show emotion. Don't talk about your problems. Don't share your mistakes. Yep. I mean, even to this day, when I go visit my parents, my dad always says, hey, come in the backyard. Let me see how many pull-ups you can do, how many push-ups you can do. Like, let's do a little fitness challenge. The dude's in his mid-70s, right? He's still trying to
Yeah.
do crazy stuff in the yard. Um, so I didn't believe in any of that stuff. I thought it was completely dumb. And uh, so for me, what happened is shortly after I signed the contract writing for this book, I had a series of panic attacks. And I don't know if you've ever had a panic
Yeah,
attack.
that's
If
what I
any of
had. I hid my panic attacks for 15 years. I was having them,
oh, dude,
and no,
it's this,
and I also didn't know what was happening to me. So I
yeah,
was kind of
it's the
in.
scariest thing that has ever happened to me because the first time you have one, you don't know what it is.
You
You
think you're
think you're
dying?
dying.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
I felt like I was having a heart attack. And so, my body started convulsing a little bit, like I had the shakes from the flu. My wife drove me to the emergency room. It was in the middle of the pandemic. Nobody in the emergency room could see me. I couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. And then finally, I went to go in to see a doctor like 2 weeks later, and I was just freaking out. I was like, I cried to my mom and my parents. I'm like, I think I'm dying. You got to take care of my kids. Like, it was full on, like nuts.
Hmm.
And so I finally get in to go see a doctor. She checks my heart and everything, and she's like, "You're totally good." And she's telling me, she's like, you might want to go see like a brain doctor. I'm like, "What are you kidding me? Like, you mean I need to go talk to a therapist?" And so, of course, sure enough, I end up talking to a therapist, and she told me, she's like, "Well, what's going on in your life?" We're talking about my family a little bit, and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm writing this book on vulnerability." She's like, "You're doing what?" I said, "Yeah, I'm writing this book on vulnerability." And so it became apparent that one of the reasons that I was having these panic attacks is because I was writing a book about vulnerability when I didn't believe in vulnerability. And I was forcing myself to be vulnerable and to kind of go down that road. But mentally, my brain was like, "You don't believe in this. You think it's stupid. Like, why are you doing this?" And, panic attacks.
Mm.
Um, so very, very unpleasant experience, as I'm sure you know. But what's funny, I shared this with my team and I said, has anybody else experienced this? And, we have I think we had around 9 or 10 people at the time. And I think 4 or 5 other people on my team were like, yeah, that's happened to me before. And so we were able to talk about it, which is, nice to be able to relate to that. So getting back to well-being, there's a lot that we could talk about in this space. I have concerns about well-being programs. And the reason for that is because well-being programs are becoming a little bit like everything programs. So well-being is basically doing anything and everything that you can do to take care of your people, whether it's free food, gyms, whether it's access to a therapist, whether it is time off, regardless of what it is, right? It's basically like, we got to take care of you, whatever you need. And a lot of this happened during the pandemic, right? During the pandemic, a lot of people were freaking out and companies invested heavily in well-being programs. Not necessarily that we had bad intentions for them, but what my concern with these well-being programs is it removes some of the accountability and responsibility from employees. So one of the things that I've kind of argued for a while is that a lot of your employees primarily care about 4 things. They want to be paid well. They want to work for a good leader. They want to have learning and development opportunities, and they want to be able to grow inside your company. And you can add flexibility in there too. A lot of the other stuff is kind of sprinkled on top, right? But if you give employees those 4 core aspects of work, that they will want to be part of your organization. Because a lot of the other stuff, purpose and meaning, recognition, that stems from those 4 things. If you work for a great leader, you're going to have those things. And so what I think is happening, and there's been an interesting book, several books actually, one fairly recently called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. Another one called The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Luciano, I believe, that came out a few years ago, also with Jonathan Haidt as one of the co-authors. And one of the things that they argue is that, and it's not a book about work. It's a book about just parenting and life and kids and what's happening society. And them and many other authors have argued that one of the reasons, especially Gen Z, is having a hard time is because what we've seen over the past few years is we've coddled our kids. Whether you look at playgrounds, where there used to be a time when playgrounds used to have these big jungle gyms, there was
Yeah.
potential of getting hurt,
Yeah.
right? You could climb up there, and now everything is very safe, right? You walk by a playground sometimes, and now they have rules where you can't play football unless there is somebody supervising, no roughhousing, no this, and everything is safe, everything is contained. As parents, we're teaching our kids, there's no such thing as a bad idea. You're great. You're amazing. And we're seeing that a lot of, and there was an article that came out, I think it was even published by Sherm, that said that Gen Z is the least resilient, kind of least adaptive generation. And so we've put this generation, and not just them, but several others, in a safety box. And we're basically telling them, we'll take care of you. Everything is going to be fine. You don't want to be triggered. You don't want to feel unsafe. You don't want to, whatever, right? Safety bubble. And now what's happening is this generation is coming into the workplace. And I put this on Substack today. I said, are our organizations becoming the new helicopter parents for Gen Z? So in other words, as an individual, let's say I don't take care of myself at all. I don't make time for friends. I don't have a social circle. I don't eat healthy. I don't exercise. I don't do any of the things that I should be doing to take care of myself. And I show up to work and I say, hey, I'm lonely. I'm disengaged. I don't have purpose. I don't have meaning. Fix this for me. Now, that's not very healthy. So the big challenge that I think we're starting to see is organizations need to find a balance when it comes to well-being programs between what they are accountable and responsible for versus the message that they give to their employees as far as you're accountable and you're responsible. Right? I mean, because you still exist as a human being, right? I mean, you still have to take care of yourself in some way. And again, it's not to say that these well-being programs are inherently bad. They all have good intentions. But I think what's happening is that companies are starting to become everything, and that's not sustainable. And so what's going to happen in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, in 4 years, in 10 years, in 15 years? I think as well-intentioned as these well-being programs are, we need to take a step back from them and say, well, how are we helping employees become better versions of themselves by being accountable and responsible as well? Do you see what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, they need to own, like they need to own it too.
Yeah,
right?
companies are in danger of becoming parents for their employees. And once you get into that role of being a parent for your employee, it becomes very hard to go back. And I talk to a lot of CHROs about this, as I'm sure you have. And I always ask them, I say, you introduce these programs, therapist, counseling, whatever. I said, what do you think would happen if you started taking these programs away? And they said, oh, probably our employees would be upset. And so what happens is when you introduce these things, it becomes very hard to take them away. It's like parenting. If you give your kids something, it's like that story. If you give a mouse a cookie, they're going to want some milk. If you give your kids something and they get used to it, it becomes very hard to take it away. So we need to be just very, very thoughtful of the well-being programs that we're offering and how we're approaching that. Because we see there was another recent survey that came out that said 26% of Gen Z employees are now bringing a parent with them to work.
I couldn't believe that when I heard that.
To the interviews, right? You saw that, right?
That shocked me when I saw that. Yeah. I was like, what?
And these are actually employees where their parents are speaking during the interview process.
No way, man. I don't believe. I almost don't believe it. Like I still haven't come to terms with that one.
It's crazy stuff, right? And so a lot of things come out that show that Gen Z is not confident. They don't have the communication skills. They are struggling in a lot of these areas. And so part of it is, are we doing more harm or are we doing more good by telling employees, show up to work and we'll take care of everything for you? So again, I'm trying to be careful not to say that these programs are bad, but I think they need to be they need to be done in a more thoughtful way. So for example, maybe companies can take a step back and say, well, we won't necessarily pay for all these things for you, but we'll make them available for you. And if you want to take advantage of them while you're working here, you can do so. You can pay for them. It'll be a little bit of a discounted rate, but it's on you. And that way the employee needs to be more thoughtful, more discerning, more, right? You have to opt in for it, as opposed to if you show up to work and say, hey, yeah, I know there's a counselor there. I'm kind of having a weird day. Let me just go talk to a therapist for a bit. Right. Then it just becomes,
there's no accountability.
Yeah. It's like having a pill that you can just take and you show up to work and you're just popping that pill all the time. So we need to, figure out what that right approach is. And part of it is how the programs are designed. Part of it is the programs that we offer. Part of it is how we communicate these programs. And part of it is also just general talking to our employees and saying, look, this is a culture where performance matters, where merit matters, how you do matters. We will do everything that we can to support you, but make no mistake that this is work, right? This is a company, this is a business. And I'm not saying
I've
communicate
seen,
it like that, but a
yeah,
little, you know what I mean?
yeah, I've seen companies, and you may have probably spoke about similar CHROs who have like their compensation and benefits. They even have an element tied to the health of the individual of the employee. So they'll say if you
Hmm.
got, we'll do a medical, and if you're this level of health, you get more. You get more access to resources, more access to benefits, more access to things, and so they're encouraging it by and putting
Yeah,
putting the own. I mean, sometimes they can go extreme, but they're putting some ownership on the individual to say, "Hey, we're not here
yeah.
to make you eat, sleep, and drink healthy."
Exactly.
Um,
Doing fitness challenges, right? Leaders
yeah,
can do, if employees have Fitbits or Apple Watches, you say, hey, I went on a crazy run today, this and that, or maybe you have like a run club at work, things that you can do that still make it fun and social and encourage it without saying like, hey, here's everything for you. I hope you're okay. You know what I mean? Like it's gotten too much in that area,
yeah.
too much in that area.
I want to go back to my other point. No, my other point in the beginning was, what are your thoughts then about CEOs, senior leadership, talking about their own struggles with mental health and well-being? Because then that can again impact
Yeah.
the view of, I can't say the company's name. I wish I could, but I got a call from a CHRO a couple months back and said, Chris, we're really struggling with the perception we have internally with mental health, and our CEO is refusing to talk about it.
Mm.
Even though that we know he's personally struggling, so we want, and many of us are. So we wanted to do, like an all hands, webinar, etc., with the team, and some of the leaders to be vulnerable and share, hey, we're also struggling. It's not just, everyone else, even at the leadership, and they flat out refused.
Mm.
The CEO flat out refused to do it, right? For the reasons we described, doesn't want to be seen as vulnerable, doesn't want shareholders to feel like there's something wrong, but what we ended up doing is actually getting some of the other executive team members to jump on a podcast with me, and we did these sort of short 20-minute podcasts, and then we distributed them but weekly, and there was a huge positive reaction both from customers, investors, employees, and actually the CEO then kind of came around because he was like, oh, okay, it's not so scary. But I'm not saying that works for everyone. It's just something we did, and it's a very large company that everyone listening knows of. I just can't say who it was because it was a private internal thing. So I want to know what your thoughts are on the CEO and the leadership team sharing that type of vulnerability as opposed to a competence-based vulnerability.
Well, I still think you need to add leadership to any kind of vulnerability. So even if you're talking about mental health, you could talk about the challenges and the struggles that you're faced with, but also talk about what you're trying to do to overcome them.
Okay.
Right. I struggle with anxiety or stress or panic attack, or I had this and that, but here's what I'm trying to do to solve that problem.
To instill
I'm trying to take
confidence.
care of myself. Right. So it's not just here's my problem. It's here's my problem. Here's how I'm trying to solve my problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because I struggle with this just like everybody else. And so here's what I'm trying to do. Here's what you might be able to do as well.
Yeah.
That's a very different message than simply just talking about it.
Yeah.
So, but in general, I'm in favor of addressing challenges and obstacles and problems in any capacity. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of leaders are so uncomfortable with this is because they forget that other piece. They forget that leadership piece. They think that they just have to go in front of their company and say, hey, I'm struggling with mental health and depression and anxiety and stress. And I'm having a hard time showing up to work in the morning and this and that. And yeah, if you just go in front of your company and say that, people are going to look at you and they're going to say, what the hell? This is the guy leading our company?
Yeah.
Like somebody who just has depression and stress and anxiety. Like it doesn't create, a positive perception of you. But if you deliver that same message and say, hey, sometimes I struggle with depression and anxiety and stress, but you know what I do to get over that so that I can show up and be the best leader that I am every single day for you? Here's what I do. I try to make time for myself. I try to exercise and spend time with my wife, my kids, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Here's what I'm doing. And even though I struggle with these problems, when I still show up to work every day, I'm able to do the things that I need to do. And sometimes I have bad days. Sometimes I have really great days, but these are the strategies right? That's a very different message. That puts adding that leadership piece, the
Sure.
competence piece in there, I think it makes a huge, huge difference.
Yeah.
So I think if leaders were more understanding and aware that they could do that, we would be able to have more of these open conversations around it. And, the other challenge with, so many stats, right? Burnout stats, loneliness stats, engagement stats, blah, 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 blah. I'm always skeptical of those for a few reasons, because if you look at a lot of them, there's never been a time where employees were not burned out. There's never been a time where engagement was super high, right? What did it fluctuate by 2%, 3%? There's never been a time where all of these numbers were just amazing and something happened and these numbers all of a sudden became terrible and we're trying to get back to those great numbers again. That time never existed. Overall, it's been relatively flat depending on the number that you look at, with some, spikes and dips here and there, but that's just kind of been constant. And the assumption is always that it's the company's fault. It's the organization's fault. It's the leader's fault. Like, what are you as a company doing about that? But how come we don't have more conversations around what are you doing about this as a human being, right? You're lonely? Great. What are you doing to solve that problem? Why are you all like, why is it the company's responsibility to fix your loneliness? Why is it the company's responsibility to give you purpose and meaning? Why is it the company's responsibility to make sure that you're engaged, make sure that you're learning and growing and developing? Why is it the company's responsibility to make sure that you have a friend? Like, putting all of that, this is what I mean when I say companies are becoming parents. It's not realistic. And so we need to give more accountability and responsibility to employees. You're lonely. What are you doing when you get home after work? What are you doing on the weekends? You don't have purpose and meaning. What are your personal values that you care about? Are you even at the right company? Like, why did you take this job? Right? So there's not enough.
Do you feel like leaders are equipped to have those conversations?
Well, it's not even that leaders need to have those conversations. It's people need to have those conversations with themselves.
I get that, but there is a role of obviously, that being recognized.
Yeah.
I've had those conversations with employees before where I've called them out on it. Not called them out, but really just help them be like, hey, it's not on us. There's something you need. There's something you need. I can only do so much on my side.
Exactly.
So that was a challenge when me and Shane first started the company. I did feel like a sense of ownership for that. And I was like, I realized I can't be responsible for someone else's happiness.
You can't. And it's not perfect. It's messy. It doesn't always work out well. So similarly, like I had somebody on my team that I worked with, and this was several years ago. And things started off well. And as the business grew, she had a lot of challenges and she had a lot of struggles. And she would show up late for meetings and she would say, oh, my dog is sick. And she would show up late for another meeting and say, oh, I couldn't do this. I couldn't do it. And it was time and time again. And it went on like this for months. And finally, I came to her and I said, look, I don't know what is going on in your personal life. It sounds like you're having challenges. It doesn't also sound, and I always say, is there anything I can do? Can I help you? Should we move the meeting? You need to take a day off, like whatever I can do. Nothing would work. And so finally I came to her and I said, look, it seems like you have some challenges that you're going through. And these challenges are starting to negatively impact the business. And I've done everything that I could to try to help you. And I've also encouraged you and I've told you that if you are not able to take accountability and solve your problems, that, we're going to have a challenging time working together. And I had to let this person go. And it's true, right? Employees also need to be accountable and responsible for whatever it is, right? And so sometimes it's a tough love approach, but it's also important. I mean, I've had to be in that situation where I've had to work and I've had to hire babysitters, or I've had to find a nanny, or I've had to wake up at 3 a.m, or I had to go to bed at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. I had to do whatever I needed to do to be able to get the job done, because that is what was expected of me. And nobody cared about my excuses. And I'm not saying that there aren't certain situations and circumstances where we can't be more compassionate and empathetic, but I think at a certain point, we need to be able to have an honest conversation with our employees and say, look, I get that you're going through a tough time and I'm happy to help you in any way that I can. But ultimately, you need to do what you need to do to take care of yourself, right?
Yeah.
And it's an important message, because otherwise leaders are going to crumble. I mean, imagine you lead a team of 50 people and you have 50 employees who are showing up to work every day, and all of a sudden you, the leader, are the therapist. And everyone's coming to you. I'm not engaged. I don't have purpose in meeting, blah, 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 blah. And you as a leader are like, whoa, what's happening here? Right? So I think leaders are equipped to have certain types of conversations. Like we can talk about and say, hey, I noticed that lately maybe the quality of work has been going down a little bit. Like, are you okay? Are you going through a tough time? Is there anything I can do to help you? Like those types of conversations any human being can have, just to try to be supportive and this and that. But I think if we start getting into this realm of like, doom and gloom, I wake up every morning and I don't want to be here anymore. Leaders I don't think are equipped to have those types of conversations. Those are deeper, more serious conversations. Yeah. So it's tough, right? And this is, like I said, it's messy. It's because human beings are messy. We're imperfect. We make mistakes. We fumble. We say the wrong things all the time. Expecting anything would be unreasonable. But I think we just need to have a much better balance of employee accountability and responsibility versus what the organization does. Mm-hmm. And simply showing up to work, assuming your company is going to solve your problems, is not the right approach.
No. One thing I do want to ask.
And you might get some angry comments after this, right? You might get some angry emails from people that are saying, "How dare Jacob this and that, blah blah blah." But look, it's the truth.
It's important we have this conversation. Part of the solving the problem is having this conversation that we're having right now.
Yeah. And by the way, if there's anything you disagree with, let me know.
No, I do think we've gone a step too far. I do agree. Like, I feel like, as I said, I've had conversations with employees in the last last 12 months, similar to what you described, where I've been like, I've done everything I can, and feel like I'm responsible for this person's happiness, and I'm like,
yeah.
At a certain point, I'm like, I've kind of offered help.
It's enormous pressure.
I've offered help. You've rejected it. I've offered help outside of the company. It's like, expert help. You've rejected it. Now it's starting to affect the workplace, like to your point, and the work, us as a business. And I'm like, and I felt like helpless. And I realized that, to your point, I was like, I'm not responsible. Yeah. I can't be held responsible for someone else's happiness. Like, I'll do as much as I can to help, like, genuinely. But I can't do that. And I do feel like organizations are taking on that burden. So I do agree with you. Yeah. There are going to be special circumstances where there are mental health challenges, where there are other things. So we do have to be careful when we talk about that part.
And it's funny, if you ask a lot of CHROs, why do you have these programs? I mean, I've asked a lot of CHROs this, and I would say, well, what would happen if you cut these programs? They'll say, well, our competitors have it. And so I think
sometimes
one of the challenges,
just because of that, yes, right.
Exactly. Yeah, and so the challenge is it's a snowball effect where your competitor,
it's expected now. Yeah.
Your competitor does it, therefore you have to do it.
Yeah.
And your competitor went up to you and you went. And so what happens is, collectively as an industry, as HR, as organizations, we're trying to one up each other with these different types of well-being programs and perks, to the point where it becomes almost unsustainable. One CHRO that I interviewed, she said, over the past few years, we didn't realize it, but we've created a company for children. And now we're trying to create a company for adults. And I think that is sort of a pivotal shift. And another CHRO, this is the CHRO from TELUS, she gave me this great analogy. She said, one of the reasons why a lot of companies get well-being programs wrong is because they think about it in terms of programs instead of in terms of culture. Mm. And she said, the best approach that you can do is have a well-being culture.
Because then people don't rely on the programs.
Yes.
They're taking the ownership of their own well-being.
Yeah. And a well-being culture is exactly that. It's like, fitness challenges. It's having conversations. It's being able to talk about stuff. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to, talk to a therapist today, a counselor tomorrow. Here's this, here's that, here's that. It's just a culture where we want to be healthy.
Yeah.
Healthy snacks, healthy, right? It's a different approach.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, before I let you go, I want to at least leave some practical ways that our audience can apply some of this. So what advice would you give to the audience of some ways that they can apply this and get the reps in, as it were, to start making it part of their daily habit?
Sure. So specifically when it comes with leading with vulnerability, I mean, the cover of the book is a mountain. So it's...
Oh, yeah, there it is.
Yeah. You can see... So people who are watching, so it's basically somebody getting ready to climb this mountain. And the reason why we picked the mountain is because, and my wife came up with that idea, by the way. All good ideas come from her. And the reason why we picked a mountain is because climbing a mountain is hard. And as anybody who's ever done any kind of hiking or walking or whatever, you notice that the base camp of the mountain is pretty easy. And then the higher up you go, the harder it becomes. But at the same time, the more people you meet on the journey, the farther out you can see, the more beautiful the vistas become, the more clarity you get. So as you go up that mountain, even though it becomes harder and harder to go, you see a lot of tremendous benefits and impact from doing so. So the best piece of advice I always give people is create your own vulnerability mountain. And what that means is pick something that's pretty easy for you to do. That's your base camp. And pick something that's really hard for you to do. That's your peak. And once you have your base camp and your peak, you take steps slowly each day to get there. So I'll give you an example. Penny Pennington is the CEO of Edward Jones. And she told me that early on, this kind of vulnerability and connection was really, really hard for her. And oftentimes she would get into elevators with her employees and she would freeze. She didn't know what to say. And her employees, it would be weird, right? You get into the elevator with your CEO of a 55,000 person company and your CEO is just standing there and everyone's like, what the hell's going on? Yeah. So it was very uncomfortable for her. So one of the things that she started to do is she started to almost have a little bit of a rehearsed
icebreaker.
A rehearsed icebreaker where she would talk about like what she did over the weekend, what she learned. She read a cool book and this and that. And so she would rehearse it and practice it each time before she would come into the office. And she did this for a while until it just became second nature for her. And she was able to just connect with her employees and say, hey, how's it going? Like, here's what I'm working on. Here's my challenge, what I'm learning, this and that. So that was her base camp, something that she was able to do and start. And so something at the peak of that mountain could be anything. I mean, it could be talking about a mental health challenge and what you're trying to do to overcome it. It could be, everyone has different peaks and everyone has different base camps. But I think once you start to create this vulnerability, this leading with vulnerability mountain for you, it'll really help you because it gives you kind of a path that you need to take. And you will make mistakes. I can promise you that vulnerability will get used against you at some point in your career, as to be expected. But it's not going to happen nearly as often as you think.
Yeah.
It's sort of like,
that was one of my
how
concerns.
many times?
That was one of my concerns. It's happened once or twice maybe, but nowhere near like way more pros than negative.
Yeah, it's not like every time you do it or 50% of the time. It might happen, 10% of the time.
Yeah.
But that's life. Like how many times do you ask for a promotion and you get turned no? How many times do you get asked for a client and you get turned no? Or when you ask somebody out on a date and you get turned no? This happens all the time. You don't just stop, right? If somebody says, hey, can I have a promotion? I'm doing really good work. And you say, no, it's not a good time. Are you never going to ask again? No.
Yeah.
And so you will get beat up. You'll make the wrong path. You'll have to go back down to go back up. It's going to be messy and confusing and this and that, but you'll see tremendous impact and tremendous benefits.
Yeah.
So create your own vulnerability mountain. I think that's the best thing. And the second piece of advice is just remember that leading with vulnerability, the vulnerable leader equation. Leadership plus vulnerability equals leading with vulnerability. Don't just do one or the other.
Yeah. Save some for the book. All right. So on that point, where can people grab a copy, and also where can they reach out to you personally if they want to work with you? As you know, our show is predominantly CHROs. You work with many incredible CHROs. So where can they reach you directly and grab a copy of the book?
Sure. So the book, we made a special URL for that, which is leadwithvulnerability.com. My website is thefutureorganization.com. And so my email is jacob@thefutureorganization.com. And then I have a Substack, so email where I share a lot of these insights, and that's greatleadership.substack.com. And then through one of those places, there's social and LinkedIn and the podcast.
Still doing the podcast?
Yes, sir.
Give it a shout out.
Yeah, the podcast is called Great Leadership, available wherever you can find a podcast. So I interview a lot of CEOs on there, grilling them on leadership. Yeah, it's fun.
I love it. And for everyone listening, as always, all of those links are below. So wherever you're watching, listening right now, they're already there. So no excuse. Make sure you go grab a copy of the book. Also, I definitely suggest following Jacob on LinkedIn. You post some great content there. You've got the LinkedIn newsletter on there as well with great content. So make sure you go and subscribe to that. I think, what's the newsletter called? It's like just called Leadership something, right? What's
also Great Leadership?
Yeah, just Great Leadership. Yeah. Yep.
I
love how simple you kept that. When I first saw that, I was like, great title of a newsletter. What is it? Great Leadership. Great.
Yep.
Yeah. Good,
exactly.
Smart choice. Listen, honestly, it's always a pleasure chatting with you. I'm excited to get this book into the hands of all of the members of our audience and our listeners. And you gave us a sneak shout out for the next one around employee experience. So we definitely have to get that one arranged when you're ready.
And one more year.
Yeah. Well, listen. Until then, don't work too hard. Have some breaks. But I look forward to doing it again soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.